So we're here to present Uwazi to you, which is an open and flexible database application that was developed by HURIDOCS, and it was mainly developed for human rights defenders who need to manage large collections of information, right? And we understand that for actors documenting violations, there are specific things that you need with your database and with your collection of information. So we have tried to make sure that within Uwazi, we are constantly improving and growing and building features that make your documentation efforts easier and more efficient, right? So through this demo, we hope to present some of those features to you and show you how Uwazi can be instrumental in your documentation efforts. So the first thing you need to understand about Uwazi is that every organization's database in itself is called an Uwazi instance. And we generate an Uwazi instance free of charge for any human rights defender or organization that is interested in this tool. So what you see in front of you here is an example of what an instance can look like. And this would obviously be subject to the kind of collection you have, but this is an example to keep in mind. And once you are able to receive your instance, you can then start uploading information within that instance, right? And once you do that, you can really enter information in different ways and make sure that all the different formats of information that are available to you can be captured. So Uwazi supports free text, PDF files, various kinds of media files, text documents, photos, videos, all of which can directly be uploaded and interacted with within the tool. And that makes for a very interactive experience and flexible tool which allows you to edit and make changes as needed. Now, one of the main features of Uwazi is to be able to process large amounts of documents, specifically PDF documents. So if you see in the example in front of us, we have a PDF that has various references to it. So that is one thing that Uwazi does. So if you see here, it shows that this PDF has 128 references. And what that means is that as somebody who's working with this PDF, I could see that there are various other UN documents, treaties, court documents that are relevant to this document. So I can actually connect specific paragraphs within this PDF to those documents. And what this would do is, as a user, when I click on this PDF, I'm not just looking at the information that this PDF gives me, but it's also giving me relational information on other documents that are linked to this particular PDF, right? And what we have recently built into Uwazi is the ability to OCR your documents, and OCR stands for optical character recognition. And what that means is that there are times when we all have documents within our collections, but it is not machine readable, which means that the database would not be able to search from within the text of that PDF, right? And what OCR does is it enables text inside your PDFs or scanned images to actually be searched within the database. And if you can see here in this orange rectangle, this is what the OCR button is, right? So if your document is already OCR, the system would be able to search within the documents. But what the OCR function allows you to do now is you can upload your document, OCR your PDF within Uwazi, and then all the text within that PDF would be able to be searchable through the Uwazi search engine, right? And we also want to highlight that this OCR function works for materials in multiple languages, and it's completely possible within Uwazi. So now we want to talk a little bit about how Uwazi does this and how Uwazi can be really set up for your collection, right? Now, the first thing to keep in mind is that we need a data structure. So we always first think about what is the collection that we're trying to build, what are the various pieces of information we're trying to build according to our workflow and our goals. So we would first create an Uwazi instance, be a logged in user in the database. And let's say for this example, I represent an organization that collects information relating to a particular human rights violations, and I'm interested in information around victims, perpetrators, locations, and event details, right? Now, my goals within that collection would be that I would want to document as much information as possible on the victims, identify perpetrators and their patterns, and also want to record the event details. So these three components of information I can identify are very important for me to collect and are available for me to collect, right? So the first thing I would do within Uwazi is think about these three components or buckets of information. So we can see that we have one emerging for the victim, we have one emerging for perpetrator, and we have one emerging for event, right? And this is what we call a template within Uwazi. And a template is basically a container or a bucket that defines the kind of information you want to populate within that particular template, right? So I'll play the recording here so you can see what a template can look like within Uwazi. So this is the Uwazi interface from the settings. And you can see in front of you in just a moment what an empty template looks like, right? So it's called record of incident. We've given the template a title, but this is essentially what an empty template looks like. And you can see there's a variety of fields, so property types to choose from. So in an incident template, I could potentially want to capture date. I could want to capture the location if that's available to me. And I can also capture text or a description about the incident, right? And here we can see that the property types can be labeled according to your collection's needs, and they can really be customized to how you need it. Similarly, we've created this for record of incident. We could create the same kind of template for our victim and our perpetrator templates. And what that gives us is this container, 3 different containers to store our 3 components of information in, and gives us more structured data when we're trying to organize our information. Now, another thing to keep in mind while creating templates is a type of property called SingleSelect and MultiSelect properties. So in Uwazi, you have the space to specify one or more lists of terms, which will be used within those SingleSelect or MultiSelect properties, right? So in Uwazi, those lists of terms, we call them thesauri. And if you can see in front of us, we have various categories of thesauri listed over here. And one of them being ethnic group. And when you would click on ethnic groups, you could see a list of specific terms that have been defined by the user, right? Now, what this would do is, let's say I connected ethnic groups to a SingleSelect property. I would be able to choose one of the options from the ethnic group list. And if I connected the ethnic group thesauri to a MultiSelect property, I could then choose as many options as are relevant to the information that I'm collecting, right? And thesauri is a really, really interesting and important way to create a control list of terms that allows for a standard way of collecting information, and also being able to use those lists of terms across your database in different contexts, right? Now, once you have set all of this up, you will have created a template, you will have added the different property types that are relevant to the information that you're collecting. You would then be able to start entering information in your collection, right? Now, within each template, each recorded piece of information is called an entity. So here, if we see in the example in front of us, we have this template called the UN Human Rights Council resolution. So this pink tag that you can see signifies the template. And information entered within that template is called an entity. So in this case, the entity is a resolution called Situation of Human Rights in Burundi with the full title, right? And I can add various entities under the template UN Human Rights Council resolution. And then this will allow me to create various types of information within the same template. Now, once you have started populating your database, have created various kinds of entities within your database, we would want to be able to view and interact with this information in different capacities, right? So currently, Uwazi has 3 ways in which you can browse through all your entities and display them. They are table view, card view, and map view. In the table view, as you can see on the left cornermost side, you are able to see your information in this tabular format that allows you to see the columns, each property as a column of information on this table view, right? And it shows you a lot of information at the same time. And then we have the specific functionality to be able to hide certain columns that you're not interested in looking at that point. So let's say I'm looking at information about record of incident, and I only want to see geolocation for where that incident happened. I could hide all the other columns such as date and description in my table view format. And on top of that, I could then filter by type of incident and location and so on and so forth as the filters, which we will go in a little bit. In the card view, which is the second view that we see in front of us, Uwazi displays each entity as a card, and it will have your entity title and also a tag to signify which template the entity belongs to. You could also then choose to have certain properties displayed on the entity on the card itself. So what this allows is for easier access to crucial information from the larger card view rather than the user having to click on each card, going to the full entity view to see key information about that component, right? Lastly, in the views, we have map view. So map view is a very powerful tool which allows you to visualize your information based on geolocation data that you might have collected for certain templates. So this allows you to visualize any entity that has a geolocation property on it on the larger map, right? And if you can see on the right cornermost side, there are those bubbles. So they will signify how many entities you have per location. And the more you zoom into the map, the bubbles will separate depending on the exact latitude and longitude entered. Further on the map, you can then filter by different categories and different types of lists that you have defined. So the map view is another way to really visualize your data in an interesting way. And we also have a way to toggle between the base layer map view and the satellite view, which is, we have that view configured within Uwazi. Also important to note that within every entity, while you do have properties, which are basically like date, description, type of violation, and so on and so forth, there's also the space for supporting files and your main document, PDF. So all of that lives on the same entity. So you could have information about an incident, a PDF that is maybe the incident report, and supporting files that could be media files that you have received from the field, right? And all that information can be viewed right from one entity and is completely interactable within Uwazi without you having to download anything onto your local device. Now, once you have your entities set up, your template structure in place, and your properties enabled, you would also want to think about how you can create connections between the different pieces of information that you're collecting, right? And in Uwazi, we can do that through the relationships function. So if you see here in this example, we can see that there is an entity, there's an entity called Death of James Miller, which is a record of incident. So the template is record of incident and the entity is called Death of James Miller. And we can see that this particular entity is connected to a victim entity and a perpetrator entity. And this gives us this sort of larger narrative of what might have happened in this incident, and also gives us individual information about the journalist and the perpetrator involved. And it's important to note that you can create these connections on multiple levels, right? This is something that you can really configure according to the collection that you're working with. So for example, if you have one perpetrator who is linked to many, many victims, you can create those many connections as needed to that one perpetrator, right? Or let's say you have multiple victims who are connected to one incident, you could make those connections and make sure that whenever somebody clicked on the record of incident entity, they could see that there are multiple victims involved in this incident. And the relationships feature, which looks like this, would allow you to do that. So this is what an initial configuration of Uwazi can look like, which consists of creating your data structure, templates, properties, thesauri, the different card view, the different views that your entities are available in, and to be able to create relationships. Okay, so that is what a relationship looks like on the template level, right? So now if we were to take this concept a little further, and this one is a little more complicated, is let's say you have relationships established between your key pieces of information, right? So the example that we saw was we had a relationship between a record of incident and a victim, and we had a relationship between a record of incident and the perpetrator. So that once that is built, you also have the possibility to transfer and display important metadata from one entity to a second related entity, right? So this process is what we call inheritance within Uwazi. And the way it works is that, let's say you create a relationship between an individual and an event, so a victim and an event, you can direct Uwazi through inheritance to automatically transfer information about the individual on the event entity. So what that means is that if I'm working with a victim entity and the victim entity is capturing information such as date, such as age, gender, nationality, and I'm entering information about the event that that victim has been a part of, by inheritance, I wouldn't have to enter information about the victim again on the event entity, right? So I would just create a relationship between the event and the victim and say that these two are connected. And through inheritance, key information about the victim would automatically reflect in the event entity, right? So we can see this example here. So first of all, we'll create a person. So we'll create an individual entity or a victim entity, and we'll enter information about their name, nationality, and age. And click save. And now we will create an entity within the event or the submitted information about this person. So to capture that information separately as well. So we have date of incident, type of violation, all of which are information we would need to enter for the first time. But instead of entering information about the victim's age, full name, and nationality again, we would simply use inheritance. So what we just saw, and as you will see that once my colleague has clicked save, information such as full name, nationality, age is now reflecting on this other entity automatically, right? And this is what we call multi-inheritance, because multiple components of the person template are now reflecting on the submission form template. And this allows for, I think, a more effective workflow within the database. And on a day-to-day basis, what it would mean is that if you structure your information in the correct way and set up inheritance or multi-inheritance, you would actually not have to enter information over and over again. But through those linkages and via inheritance, key pieces of information would inherit and automatically reflect in the correct entities. And that is what we call multi-inheritance. Right. Now that we've organized our content and we've really started populating the database with the information that we need, we can now think about how we would want to explore our collection and how we would want to be able to glean insights from it in a few different ways, right? So the one thing that we wanted to really emphasize on is Uwazi's capability to filter. So if we see this example here, and this is the North Korean footprints database by TJWJ, we can see that they have various templates enabled here, right? So you can see that their templates in the database are victims, perpetrators, proceedings, testimonials, HR instruments, and NK resources. And you can see that there are certain aggregations next to the names of the templates. So these aggregates are dynamically pulled from how you would populate the database, and they become the first filters by which you can filter the database by, right? So if we see, we will now filter by the victim template. So we are only working for the purpose of this filtering, working within these number of entities within the database, right? So that is your first layer of filtering. Now within that, I can filter by victim type. So I can choose a particular victim type here. So I'll choose forced repatriation of escapees. Now, if you notice here, we had a very large number of victims when we started with the primary filter, right? But as soon as I chose a victim type, Uwazi automatically gave me an aggregation to indicate that under this specific type of victim, you have 58 entities. And you will see that as we filter further in the database, the aggregations will dynamically pull from that specific subset of data. So you can see we are within this particular victim type. And then if I choose nationality as North Korea, it's now giving me 36 entities that both meet these two conditions. And now we can see that the more I filter, the more specific information I'm getting, and they're meeting very specific criteria for me of what I want to know from the database, right? And with that, you can cross filter and use as many filters as you need within the database as relevant to your work. So not only does this let you get to information much faster, but I think also gives you really important aggregations. So let's say you only wanted to see information about a particular victim type, but from a certain gender. You wanted to see information about a particular nationality, but only a specific violation that they have experienced. So Uwazi can do that for you very, very quickly because it is linked to the actual properties that you yourself would set up. And filtering enables you to be really creative and set up filtering in a very complex way as well. So what we had just previously discussed was using filters within the database, right, to get to specific information and to also generate aggregates for that specific subset of data within Uwazi. Now, the second way to glean sort of insights or find your information effectively within the database is to be able to search for a keyword or a phrase. So for example, in this screencast, we can see that we are searching with the keyword detention. And we can see that immediately within the victim filter, there are 135 entities that have the mention of the word detention, whether as a property or a text or even the PDF would show up as the search result, right? Now, once the search is done and you get the results, you would also be able to then filter through those results by the properties that you have on the sidebar that you see, right? So here we saw that there were 135 entities that have the mention of the word detention. Now, within those 135, let's say I was only interested in looking at victims that are of American nationality, I could choose that particular filter and find specific information around that, right? So this is something that I want to highlight because I do believe that Uwazi's search and filter functions are very, very strong, and they are the strengths of the tool, and when configured can be used in a very powerful way. Coming to one of the questions asked about visualizing the data. So there is, once you have enough records in your database, of course, there is a way to visualize your selected data through charts, maps, and other ways. So here we will just look at some of the ways in which that can be done. So this is again an example from the North Korean footprints database by TJWG. We can see that this is their landing page, and you can see the number of victims, proceedings, perpetrators. In this chart, you can see their number of victims by year. So you can click on each of these components and see how many victims are there in a particular year. And an important thing to remember about visualizations within Uwazi, specifically configured through the components that we offer, is that it's dynamic. So that would mean that once configured, you would not have to worry about making updates to the visualizations. As your database grows and you make edits, changes, your data visualization will automatically reflect those changes in numbers, and you will be able to set that up dynamically, right? Similarly to this bar chart, if we scroll a little below, so here you can see, before we go there, you can actually see the number of victims per year. Right. And there's also a place to customize some other information as needed. There's also a way to visualize a subset of your data on the map view. So this is pulling very particularly from the number of missing victims and showing you that on the map by the geolocations mapped on those entities. And you can then further filter by it. Or you can also, it's also important to note that on the map view, those bubbles that we just saw, if you click on the bubbles, the actual entities will pop out in the sidebar. And you can then toggle to those entities and read through the information. So this means that if you're looking at particularly a region and you see there are 5 victims in that region, you can click on that bubble and the bubble will take you to those 5 victims and you can actually read through the information. So to underline my point that the visualizations are not just a way to show your information, but it's also an entry point for the users to actually interact with the data in Uwazi. With that, we are really proud to mention that Uwazi can be localized into more than 180 different languages. So both in terms of user interface and the content itself. So if the information in your Uwazi, in your collection is needed to be multilingual, you can actually go to settings and enable that language in your interface, right? So in this example, let's see how that is possible. So you would go to Uwazi settings, go to language, and we can see that the default language is English, right? But let's say I wanted to configure French. So you can choose from the list of languages available. So here we would click on French, and each language has the language code next to it also, so you can easily identify it. You would just do a couple of steps to confirm your choice and click accept. And here you can see, and that was a little subtle, but earlier on, if we go here, when it's in the default mode, you can see because English is default, you cannot see anything on the nav bar here, which is where my cursor is right now. If I go to the section where French is enabled, so just to skip a little ahead, we can see that as soon as we configured the French language, Uwazi now created two interfaces for us to work in. So that means that I can either choose to work in the English interface, or I can either choose to work in the French interface. And the interfaces are signified by the language code itself, and you can navigate to that from the navigation bar. And what this does is that you can have information in English, but now you have the space to translate that into French, or you can enter information in French and then have the space in the English UI to translate that into English, right? Now, once we have the interface enabled, the next thing we would want to look at is how your content itself could be translated within Uwazi, right? So a way to do that is to go to the translation section in Uwazi, and you'll see that as your database grows, Uwazi will create components for you to translate. So every time I create a new thesaurus, so we can see there's this thesaurus called types of violations. When I click on types of violations, I'll be able to see all types of violations in English, and I can then translate it into French, right? And here, if we go to the user interface, I can also translate the entire user interface from this section here. And as essentially what Uwazi would do is the number of interfaces you choose to engage in your database. So in this case, we have English and French. It'll create a section for you to do the translations in that particular section, right? And important to again note that we understand that user interface is something we would want to have translated should we choose to have our collection in different languages. We've also introduced the ability to do an import. So if you see here this blue button where my cursor is a little hidden, you can see that the import button would actually allow me to bring in all the user interface terms in French all in one go, rather than doing it one by one from this settings, right? So it's a matter of preference. And the CSV import function makes that a little more streamlined. Now, similar to this, we also have a live translations button, which is, I think, a component that adds on to the existing translation functions. So if you can see, this is what we call the live translations button, where my cursor is right now with the yellow underline. And when you click on that, it automatically underlines components in the database that can be translated by the live translations button, right? So if you can see here, the submission form has been underlined in this dotted yellow line, similarly to many other words that we see on the screen. And what that does, and true to the name, allows me to live translate that particular word itself. So I can now translate the word publish to French and click on submit. And then when I toggle to the French interface, I will be able to see that has been translated, right? So publish just became the French translation. So what this essentially does is that you can do your translations from the settings, and translate slowly, consistently through your database. But the live translations button is a very, very useful tool to see any missing information that hasn't been translated, because it shows you the information in real time. So you can toggle to any part of the database and then use the live translations button. It will show you what has and hasn't been translated, right? So this is something that you can identify and you can change very quickly. Just to note, in terms of the UI terms and the import of those UI terms, we actually keep and manage some translated lists of languages, and we're hoping to grow them further. But currently we do have those lists in French, Spanish, Russian, Arabic, Thai, Burmese, and more as we grow. So those are something that, that is something that, we could also provide for anybody looking to set up databases in those languages. So now coming to the question for whoever asked about permissions. So I think this would be relevant for you. Specifically, if you're working as part of a team, working as part of a distributed remote team, or generally working in a large organization, this section is important because Uwazi has important features to support collaborative work. So this basically means that there are various permissions levels that you can assign to users, right? So first of all, just to note, you can create as many user accounts as needed within the database. So that is from the option users. So you can see that Currently, there are two user types, two users within this particular database, but this list can actually grow as needed through the database, right? There's also the option for groups. So you can actually assign particular users. Let's say you have your legal team, you have the database management team, you have the investigative team. You could assign them those groups. So you can have all users that belong to a particular team within that group. And then you can share access easily through the groups rather than going through each user one by one when you're sharing information within the database, right? But before we go into that, it's important to understand that there are three kinds of user roles in Uwazi, which is the first kind is admin, second editor, and the third collaborator, right? So you can see that when creating a user account, you can actually choose between these three users and what kind of user profile you would want this person to have. And you would need to set their account up from that go. And this is something that can be changed. So you can give someone edit access and later on want to make them admin. That is something you can absolutely do at any given point, right? Now, to see the difference between these three user roles is very important, and it also is really useful for those who need different levels of permissions within the database. So an admin user is someone who would have access to all settings and all information within the database. So that means they would be able to make structural changes to the database. They would be able to define templates, thesauri, relationship types, really configure whether this database should be private, public. All of those responsibilities lie with admin user types, and you can have various admin users within your database. So you can either choose to have one person as the admin, or if you need various people to have that kind of responsibility, you can choose to assign all of them that role. Then we have the second kind of role, which is the editor access. So an editor will not be able to access the structural settings of an Uwazi. So that means that they would not get to define what list of terms are in the thesauri, what does the template contain, what kind of data, like what is this collection, private or public, or to be able to define what to filter by, right? But what an editor can do is as soon as they log in, they would immediately have access to view and edit all the information within your database. And they can then share that information with other users within the database. So this is really useful for teams where you know that certain user groups only need to enter information within the database, and they do not actually need to have touch points with the settings. So you can give them edit access or editor access within the database. The third and the newly introduced, not newly, but recently introduced collaborator role allows for more complexity with permissions and allows you to actually create user types that have specific access to specific subsets of information within your database, right? Now, what this means is that an editor can see all the information within the database. So it doesn't matter what access that information has, the editor would automatically see all the information within your database. But let's say you have an example where you need to share a subset of your data with a lawyer so that they can do some sort of legal analysis with the information to see where it stands with chain of custody, right? So you would maybe only want to give them access to 50 entities that you think will have an impact on that kind of work. So the collaborator role would be perfect for them because you can choose to give them access to only those 50 entities within your database. And even within that choice, you can decide whether you want to give them access to view or view and edit. So you decide that as the admin member, and you can decide to give them access to 50 entities and they would be able to either view or edit them, right? So there is that level of granularity and complexity that, should you want to utilize, is possible within Uwazi. So if we were to go to the next example, I can show you how that collaborator access can work, right? So if we see in this example, and we'll go a little slowly here, is that if you see this screen, the one that is in front of us here, this is a user that has been logged in as an admin, right? So this means that they have access to all the information as well as all the settings within the database. Now, this is an admin that wants to share subsets of the data with a collaborator. So we'll see how that happens. So now we just shifted the screen. I hope you noticed that. So the second screen that you can see in front of us that is showing 0 out of 0 entities is a collaborator. And like I mentioned, a collaborator will only see what you explicitly give them the permission to see, right? So right now as a collaborator, I cannot see anything because I have not been given access to any of the data in the database. So for me, the database is empty at the moment, right? Now, as an admin, let's say I want to share these 4 cases with them. So 23, 25, 26, and 27. I would click on the share button, look for that particular collaborator user role. So I can type out the username. Now, if you see here, there is the option for you to give that person, so you're giving them access to these 4 entities. So that's a specific subset of data in your database. And within that, you can choose to either give them can see or can edit access, right? So let's see what happens. So initially just gave them view access to these 4 entities. Now this collaborator will refresh their page. And you can see a database that was empty now has 4 entities in it that have been explicitly shared with them. And you can see that there is the filter for can view. So that means they know that they can only view these 4 entities. And that further is seen when they click on the particular entity. And you'll see that there is only the button to view. So there is no way for them to make any changes to the information that has been shared with them. Now, let's say we decide we actually want them to edit the information and make some changes. We can choose the can edit option and click on save changes. And this reflects in real time, right? So once they click refresh, you can see that the can view has now changed to can edit. And now they'll have a range of more options to choose from when they click on an entity. So they can now view, which was what they had earlier. They can also edit this entity. They can choose to delete it. They can also choose to share this information with another user within the database, right? So there are those permission levels. And once you understand them, you can really use it to your strength. And you can, some examples that I can give off is if you work in a network of organizations. So the secretariat can have admin access while your groups of organizations have collaborator access. If you work in separate teams, you can really make groups of teams and share information with the entire group so that they all get that information in one go without you having to share information user by user, right? And those are just some examples about information. So go to the next slide. So now the next example we want to talk about is to be able to receive information in your database from the public. So this basically allows you to see information, to get information from external sources, which is configured by a submission form that the public can configure, right? And this, I'll just quickly play the submission form. So you can see that the form has many properties. So what this means is that the external users or the public can actually fill out this form, and this would populate an actual entity within your database. Sorry, one moment. Now to talk a little bit about security really quickly. So Uwazi takes into account the security needs of the human rights defenders that we work with very, very seriously. And there are a variety of measures that we use to ensure that. But one of the main ones that we wanted to highlight for you today was the 2-factor authentication that is enabled and available for every user to have on their Uwazi account, right? So here we see that my colleague Shamrit has a username and a password that he needs to get into the database, but he also has an authentication code that he needs to generate from his app, from his authenticator app, right? And this is something that we encourage every single user within Uwazi to have on their database for enhanced security of the database itself. And this is something that is directly available for every user in the database, right? Talking about security and just for admin users to be more careful about what goes on in their database, we have an activity log that is available for only admin users. So if you can see here, this is the activity log section, and you can see that it's capturing various kinds of information about the activity that has gone on in this database, right? So you can see that Uwazi will capture when updates have happened, when entities have been created, when something has been deleted, when permissions have been updated within the database. Furthermore, it's all timestamped, so you can search from a particular date from to. You can find certain keywords that are relevant and only search by a keyword, or you could only see the activity of a particular user within the database, right? So in addition to all of these measures that we saw, We also securely host and maintain Uwazi. We undergo regular third-party security audits of the Uwazi code, and we try to do this as consistently as possible to catch and fix potential vulnerabilities with Uwazi, right? And that is something we try to do on a regular basis. To wrap up, we do absolutely want to touch upon Tella and how we are working to integrate Tella with Uwazi and how this could be relevant for the work of human rights defenders, right? So to begin, and I think Fidel can drop in the link for Tella if he hasn't already. Tella is an open source mobile application for data collection, and it is developed by Horizontal. It is currently available for Android phones, and an iOS version is being worked on currently. It functions as an app on your phone that allows you to write or take pictures, videos, and audio according to record documents of a certain event. And it has proven to be particularly useful to human rights defenders who work and operate in vulnerable or dangerous contexts, right? So we are currently working so that this tool can be integrated with Uwazi so that they can work in conjunction with each other so that information from Tella can directly drop into an Uwazi instance from the field. And we'd like to note that this will be available, this integration or this version of Tella that supports the integration with Uwazi will be available in the upcoming update of the application that will be rolled out on the Google Play Store. So you can use the current version right now, but in order to use the integration with Uwazi, you would need to download the next version that will be updated on the Google Play Store, right? So to jump right into what Tella can do, so Tella itself is, as we talked about, a key tool for documenters on the ground, but some key components that might be useful for you to know is that you can actually hide the app on your phone and you can use a different name and icon. So here we can see that it's been disguised as a calculator, and that's something that would be relevant for defenders, right? Important to remember that any videos, photos, and audio recordings, as well as other information that you would store within the app is immediately encrypted. And also important to note that they're inaccessible from the phone's gallery itself. So there's a separate gallery that Tella uses for the information that it houses. You would need your own encrypted secret lock or secret PIN to unlock Tella. And on top of that, you can use that quick lock button to shut down Tella. So this is particularly useful for documenters who operate in precarious situations where they can sense or they get to know that they might encounter unprecedented situations where they can click on this lock button and shut down the app itself, right? Which is level 1. And then the second layer is you can use the quick delete to actually delete all sensitive data from the app so that if you feel that there is the need to do that, you don't want the information to fall into the wrong hands, right? And also important to note that it hides it from your recently used app's activity. So it doesn't show as an app that you've been using on your phone, right? So now the way it would work with Uwazi is that you would actually connect it to a particular Uwazi instance. So you can see here there's a server URL. So you would use your Uwazi server URL to connect your Tella account to that particular Uwazi instance and your login credentials. And once done, you can actually download those templates that we talked about onto the app. So downloading the template itself would give you the properties that you had defined within the template. So let's say we're looking at victim, and I chose to download victim in my Tella app from the Uwazi server. I can now fill out information about the name, gender, and I can add text, images, geolocations, video documents, the same way that I would fill it out in an Uwazi instance. But in this case, Tella allows me to do this capturing of information from my phone, and then to also ensure that I can send this information when I have low connectivity or offline access in a safe way, right? And the way this is done is there are two options within Uwazi. One is the submit button and one is the submit later button. And the submit later button is crucial to remember because this actually saves your information, but keeps it safe so that once you do have connectivity or you do have enough space to submit this information, you're able to do that from the Tella app itself, right? And this enables you to really keep your information as drafts. So that's what you choose as a submit later option. Or if you do have connectivity at that point, you can choose to submit it then. And all of this would be configured within the Tella app itself. So with Tella, you can work safely online, save the information you collect, and then, of course, once you have access to the internet, you can upload the information.
Especially wraps up this particular demo, but I'm pretty sure Natasha and I can stay for a few more minutes, but for those who would like to jump out, we would like to respect your time, so feel free to do so. But we'll officially stop the recording, and we'll stay here until if people still have questions, and we'll field them accordingly. You're okay to stay, Natasha, right?
Thank you so much,
awesome.
everyone.